Hello, my name is Deborah Fox, and I'm delighted to have you join me today as I talk about the power of confident, effective, and assertive communication. I know what you're thinking, not another communication training. Well, it's true. There are many trainings out there on the topic of communication, covering everything from how to win friends, how to get what you want, the politically correct way to argue, and techniques on how to survive conflicts. The reality is that communication is a huge pool with almost as many skills as drops of water. And when you try to dive into that pool, it can become extremely confusing and overwhelming. George Bernard Shaw said it best: the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. How many times have you communicated with a friend, spouse, child, or team member, sharing detailed instructions of what you want or need, and then you ask the famous question, "Do you understand?" And they always respond with yes. Then a couple of weeks later, you figure out that they did not understand. In today's society, it gets even more complicated when you factor in the many roadblocks that prevent effective communication. In the workplace today, you may be working with 4 or 5 different generations, 4 different personalities, 2 genders, and a variety of cultural differences. And on top of that, add stress, personal issues, and what seems to be an increasing epidemic, a lack of emotional intelligence. It's no wonder that communication today often ends up as an emotional battleground. During this training, you will gain a better understanding of how emotions affect communication, discuss the 3 V's of communication, define and review assertive, passive, passive-aggressive, and aggressive communication styles, talk about the not-so-common communication styles, and learn several assertive techniques so you are able to stay calm and on track while still being able to get your points across. I will also be sharing what I call Deborah's Ditties, which will pop up like this on the screen throughout the training. These are quotes to help you remember key points as you begin your journey to improve your communication skill set. Let's start with my favorite Deborah's Ditty and the basis for this training. If you don't have the courage to confront, you don't have the right to complain. Don't wait until anger gives you the courage. Being an assertive, effective communicator requires courage, skill set, and anger control. Over the course of my career, I've had ample opportunities to witness and to learn firsthand what works and what doesn't work when it comes to communication. I've seen highly talented individuals derail their careers all because of bad communication habits. On a daily basis, people attend my communication seminars bringing with them those bad communication habits that are clearly not serving them well. And even though they aren't getting the results they want or need, they keep doing the same thing. Why? Habit. Habits are easy to fall back on, even the bad ones. So it stands to reason that we first have to talk about habits. A habit, by definition, is an action or behavior you do repetitively without thinking. Why, just this morning, you executed a habit, brushing your teeth. Now, my guess is that you did not stand there with brush in hand and say to yourself, "Now, how do I do this?" Most of you brushed your teeth and did 2 or 3 other things at the same time. Habit, the ability to perform an activity or behavior without thought. Changing a habit, on the other hand, requires extensive thought. Changing your communication habits is the subject matter for this training. This will require you to think about what you currently do, why you do it, what are your desired results, and are you actually achieving those desired results? Now, many trainers and professionals will tell you that in order to change a habit, you must execute the new habit or behavior 20 to 30 consecutive days. Well, I've trained this for years. But in recent years, I've gained an entirely new perspective on this old quote. Today, I firmly believe that it is possible to change a habit in one day. Let me tell you a story to support my hypothesis. My sister had been a smoker for almost 50 years. And over the 50 years, she tried countless different methods to stop smoking. Well, she tried the patch, the gum, arts and crafts projects, counseling, and even hypnosis, all with no luck. Then one day, she went to the doctor for her annual checkup. And while there, she shared with the doctor that she had been having some unusual symptoms. The doctor, believing it was better to be safe than sorry, recommended some tests. A week later, when my sister went back for the follow-up appointment, she was informed that she had lung cancer. That day, she came home from the doctor's appointment, threw away the pack of cigarettes in her purse, and threw away all the extra cartons of cigarettes she had stored in the kitchen. She never smoked another cigarette the entire rest of her life, all 1.5 years of it. This, of course, begs the question, why didn't it take her 20 to 30 days to change that 50-year habit? I believe the answer lies in the consequence. That brings me to our next Deborah's ditty. Behavior without consequence may not change. This quote applies to supervising people, raising children, and changing habits. I find that when faced with a motivating consequence, positive or negative, a person can change a habit in as little as one day. Now, it may take the rest of their life to stay focused on that habit, but they can change a habit in one day. When it comes to being a confident, effective, and assertive communicator, you may have habits that are simply not serving you well. And in order to change those habits, you have to ask yourself, what are the potential consequences if I don't update, change, or improve my communication skills? The answer? Well, you could lose the respect of your coworkers. You could lose the respect of your boss. You could be passed over for bonuses, promotions, or raises. And worse yet, you could be fired. I could be fired for being a poor communicator, you ask? Well, yes, every day and twice on Sunday. Here are 3 simple steps for you to follow. Step 1 in learning how to be a dynamic, effective, and assertive communicator is being willing to acknowledge what the potential consequences are to you. Step 2 is being willing to acknowledge the areas where you do have bad communication habits. And step 3 is to commit to learning and implementing new skills and techniques to change those habits. Let me repeat those. 1, identify the potential consequences. 2, acknowledge the bad habits. And 3, learn and implement better skills. It's my experience that our society as a whole is not really clear about what the difference is between assertive and aggressive communication. One thing I have observed is that many of you have, in fact, communicated confidently and assertively in the past, and you were called something else. Occasionally, when people don't like your message or just don't want to hear your message, or they are passive in their communication style, they will choose to be offended by your message and tell you that you are aggressive. Let me repeat that. They will choose to be offended and place the inappropriate communication on you. Over the years, I've heard or read countless materials on assertive communication, and most of the time, the training addresses the person who is delivering the message, how the speaker needs to change their approach, the body language, their words, and their tone. It has often appeared to me that the speaker is held responsible for a much higher percentage of the success of an assertive message. However, the time has come to place some of this communication responsibility on the message recipient. Being a great communicator is not just about delivering words. One of the most effective communication skills is listening. No, I mean really listening. Listening to what is actually being said. Well, just the other day I went through a drive-thru for lunch. I had to laugh because the conversation I had was a perfect example of someone who was on autopilot and not actually listening to what I was saying. The conversation went like this.
Can I help you?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to order a grilled chicken, apple, and cranberry wrap with a large Diet Dr. Pepper light ice, please.
Do you want grilled or fried chicken?
Grilled.
Do you want that in a salad or a wrap?
A wrap, still.
Large Dr. Pepper?
No, a large Diet Dr. Pepper. Light ice, please.
Large Diet Dr. Pepper. No ice?
No, light ice.
Thank you. Pull up to window 1.
Have you ever been in this situation? Did it frustrate you too? This is a great example of how the recipient of the message was simply not listening or engaged in the conversation and was therefore 100% responsible for the miscommunication that was taking place. Now, not only do we have to master the art of listening, we also have to master the art of listening assertively. Jack Canfield, a well-known author and speaker, brought us this famous equation: E plus R equals O. Now, translated, this means event plus response equals outcome. The event can be anything: an emotional feeling, a coworker's comment, a crazy driver, a confusing email, a layoff, the weather, your partner's behavior, well, anything. In other words, anything and everything that is outside of your control to change. The response is challenging for many people. Regardless of what unfolds in your life, you are in the driver's seat. You have the freedom to choose how you will respond. Your response is your choice. There are 3 components to your response. They are your thoughts, your emotions, and your behavior. Too often we start by trying to change our behavior before we have our thinking process lined up. Understanding your common emotional triggers can give you a blueprint for how you typically respond to certain events. It's important to note that response is the root word of responsibility. And you know what that means, right? It means that you must be 100% willing to take responsibility for your response. I like to make this comparison. If 1 plus 0 equals 1, then E plus 0 equals E. Here's what I mean. Any event combined with a 0 response leaves you with, well, the event. This principle teaches that in any given situation, the person receiving the message is equally responsible for listening assertively. This means listening to the speaker's message without getting emotional, without judgment, without preconceived notions of what the speaker means, and without taking the message personally. Have you ever been in this situation? You're walking down the hall at work when you bump into Bob. You start the "Good morning, how are you today" conversation, bombarding Bob with all sorts of information about what you did over the weekend. You call yourself trying to be nice. And instead of engaging in conversation with you about what you both did last weekend, Bob snaps at you and says, "I really don't have time to visit right now." Bob just became an event. Now, if you're like most people, you immediately jump to a conclusion that Bob is rude or mad at you or hard to communicate with, and you placed 100% of the communication responsibility on Bob. I was just trying to be nice, you say. So now, Bob's event plus your emotional response equals what outcome? Stress, tension, your hurt feelings, gossip to other coworkers, and possibly even Bob getting called into his boss's office and being told he needs to be nice to people. Well, what if Bob received bad news that morning? What if Bob just got chewed out by his boss for visiting too much? What if Bob is behind on work and simply didn't have time to visit? What if Bob is a task-driven personality and simply doesn't believe it's right to stand and visit on company time? Isn't it interesting that we never jump to those conclusions, only that Bob is a jerk, rude, and mad at us? Let's rewind that story and see what happens when the recipient takes 50% responsibility for this communication. Same event, Bob snaps at you and says, "I really don't have time to visit right now." This time, you as the recipient take responsibility for your response. This time, you say to yourself, "You know, Bob doesn't seem to be having a good day. I shouldn't have gone on and on about my weekend activities." You don't take Bob's response personally. You don't allow your emotions to influence the conclusions you jump to. Be the bigger person and simply respond by saying something like, "Sorry, Bob, didn't realize you were rushing. Hey, have a good day." It sounds easy enough, and it is until you allow those pesky emotions and insecurities to get in the way. By thinking and listening more assertively, you will become better at hearing people out without interrupting, staying unemotional in stressful or conflict situations, and not taking messages or behaviors personally. The recipient of any communication can be an assertive listener just by applying the Q-tip method. Quit taking it personally. While assertive communication is the equal responsibility of both the speaker and the recipient, society still places a huge percentage of that responsibility on the person delivering the message. So it is important to acknowledge that all messages are subject to interpretation, and unfortunately, interpretation is 9/10 of reality. Regardless what your intention or motive is when you deliver a message, people may choose to interpret it a different way. For example, if you tend to beat around the bush, you aren't clear and concise with your messages, you may be interpreted as a passive, wishy-washy, or vacillating communicator. On the other hand, if you're clear and or concise with your message, but your delivery is short and abrupt, you might be interpreted as an aggressive or abrasive communicator. As a result of this dynamic, it becomes even more crucial that we deliver our messages clearly, concisely, and nicely to avoid misinterpretation of our motive or intent. Our ultimate goal is to behave and communicate in an assertive manner as often as possible to achieve our desired results. As we prepare to explore communication styles in depth, we first must talk about emotions and how they drive our responses. This leads us to the study of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence includes 3 things: self-awareness, your ability to identify what sets you off, trips your trigger, hits your hot button, or causes you to have an emotional knee-jerk reaction. Self-management, being able to better control yourself when you do have that emotional knee-jerk reaction. I call this pulling the reins in on a runaway emotion. And social awareness, being more aware of how your actions and behaviors affect the people or situations around you. I don't know if you've noticed it, but in our society today, we seem to have an epidemic of a lack of social awareness. People are either completely unaware of how their actions affect other people, or quite frankly, they simply don't care. People cutting each other off on the highways, people screaming and yelling at the airline gate agents like that's going to get the plane to leave on time. People stepping in front of you at the checkout counter, or my personal favorite, the person in line ahead of you who is so busy talking on the phone that she's taking forever to pay for her groceries. Clearly, this lack of social awareness is a big part of emotional intelligence and could be preventing you from advancing in your career or having great relationships. So how does this emotional thing play out in the workplace? We all know that crying is considered being emotional. But that isn't the only emotional response. When you get upset, hurt, frustrated, or angry, do you bury your head in the sand and wait for the storm to blow over? Do you avoid disagreements or arguments because you really dislike conflict? Avoiding necessary conversations is an emotional response. On the other hand, when you get angry or frustrated, do you verbally attack back? Screaming, yelling, insulting others, even using profanity? Well, that's also an emotional response. If you have trouble managing your emotions in conversational situations, you will most likely respond in ways that are not considered assertive. We've talked about emotions and how they can sabotage an otherwise assertive communication. All emotional responses, crying, retreating, or blowing up, can lead to conflict. Let's face it, if discussions were always calm and assertive, we wouldn't even need the word conflict. Wouldn't that be great? Unrealistic, but a great theory. In reality, conflict does exist, and fear of it or avoiding it does not make it go away. Here's a great quote for you to remember. The purpose of argument is not victory, but understanding. Bottom line, conflict is not a dirty word. Allow me to explain conflict and why it really is not effective to ignore or avoid it. Conflict is very much like a splinter in your hand. While it is true that occasionally a splinter will work itself out, we all know that most of the time, if left unattended, a splinter will fester or get infected. In turn, that small, insignificant splinter turns into a much bigger problem than it really needed to be. Conflict is the same way. While some conflicts will work themselves out if left alone, the reality is that if left unattended, most conflicts will fester and turn into mountains. Before you know it, you are not only avoiding the conflict, but the person, department, boss, spouse, or friend that you have the conflict with. I've seen perfectly good relationships severed simply because one or both parties could not assertively address the conflict. My observation is that people don't necessarily dislike conflict. I think most people dislike the thought of conflict resolution. Consider it this way. Have you ever had a child come to you with a splinter in their hand? They stretch that little hand out, look at you, and say, "My hand hurts, can you fix this?" They are relentless about you getting that splinter out until you whip out the needle. Then they pull that little hand back in and say, "It's okay, it doesn't hurt anymore." You see, even though the splinter hurts, the child perceives that digging in their hand with that needle is going to hurt more. So they take the action necessary to avoid the perceived pain that they believe is about to happen. Adults view conflict resolution the same way. Even though the conflict with another person is uncomfortable, can cause dissension on the work team, and can just be emotionally painful, we perceive that confronting the conflict will be more painful. We're afraid of what might happen, that we might hurt someone's feelings, or that we might not be able to control our emotions. It's the perceived confrontation that we dislike. And in order to change that fear, we have to focus on self-esteem, self-confidence, personal power, and assertive communication. Wow, we just covered some really important core issues related to assertive communication. Changing habits, emotional intelligence, the recipient's responsibility, and conflict. Now that we've laid the foundation, let's start building our new communication skill set by moving to our first section, the 3 V's of communication.